Assalamu alaikum everyone. Today I want to talk about Taliban's lightning fast takeover of Afghanistan after the US withdrawal and what impact it is going to have on the region. We see different views on Twitter regarding Taliban's success. We are hearing different kind of voices, but if you look at the secular voices, they're obviously not happy about it. On the other hand, we see parties, that have been doing politics in the name of Islam. They are celebrating, although they themselves have not followed Islam in its true spirit. Hassan, I want to know the impact that this earth-shaking event, I would call it, the impact that it will have on this region and on the Muslim world, and but particularly I want to discuss how it is going to impact Pakistan. It's very interesting the way we see some analysts are reacting on social media. I want to share a few comments that I read on Twitter. One analyst, he said that the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan is profoundly dangerous development. This is true regardless of how angry you may be about the way the United States has treated Pakistan. It is true no matter how wicked and evil India's support of terrorist groups like the TTP is. And it is true no matter how excited the Muslim teenager in you is about the virtues of the simple and pure Taliban warriors that have taken over Afghanistan. Hassan, isn't this an oversimplification of the issue? It's a kind of an opinion which just wants to see the Taliban as monsters. And what do you have to say about this?
Well, first of all, that's a very broad question. I mean, if you're talking about the possible implications, then you can look at it from different perspectives. There's a strategic perspective of every neighbor to start off with. Then there's a strategic perspective for other countries at large. There are possible theological implications for this. In the past we've discussed the 6 different approaches that the so-called, I'm using the term Islamists for the lack of a better term because that's a sort of term that the West has been pushing. We've discussed in the past the 6 different approaches that Islamists adopt for the implementation of Islam. So this is actually going to impact that as well, especially those who are talking about change through the parliamentary process. If you're talking about some of the comments in the press, especially in the mainstream Western media, then what we find is this Western ethnocentrist approach, basically the West making the assumption that the ideals, the values that it holds are somehow neutral or objective reality that the whole world has to go by. Obviously, we reject such a notion. It's about a conflict of value systems, conflict of ideas, and so forth. So I think we have to be more specific as to precisely what we mean. I mean, if you're talking about, for example, the implications for Pakistan, again, even in that question, there are multiple dimensions. So, for example, there is a security implication for Pakistan. You've got groups like the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan or the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban. They are closely monitoring the situation at the moment because in the past, there has been this undeclared strategic alliance between Al-Qaeda, Afghan Taliban, TTP. There's been this narrative that the Pakistani state has pushed, creating this bifurcation between so-called good Taliban and bad Taliban. Basically, those Taliban who were just fighting in Afghanistan, they were placed in the good category. Those who were carrying out attacks in Pakistan were placed in the bad category. But the reality was that the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, they were looking at Afghanistan and Pakistan as a single war theater. So, for example, all the supply for the NATO forces in Afghanistan was moving through Pakistan. So for southern Afghanistan, the supply was going through the Chaman border in Pakistan. For northern Afghanistan and central Afghanistan, that supply was going through Turkham border. Now, who was targeting the NATO supply? It was primarily Al-Qaeda, primarily Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan that was targeting it in Pakistan. Who was benefiting as a result of that? The Afghan Taliban. So the Pakistani Taliban at this point in time would want to see whether a strengthened Afghan Taliban across the border is going to provide it that strategic backyard Now, here there's a challenge for the Pakistani state. There's also a challenge for the Afghan Taliban. The Afghan Taliban, as part of the Doha agreement, has promised that it's not going to allow anyone to use Afghanistan's soil to target any other country. Now, Pakistan could invoke that agreement and say that if TTP is using Afghan soil, Pakistan could talk about that. Similarly, East Turkestan Islamic movement would find itself restricted. Islamic movement of Uzbekistan is going to find itself restricted, and so forth and so on. So, there are many, many dimensions. So I think we would have to be more specific with the questions.
Okay, Hassan, you said that we have to, think about the other organizations as well. The militant, some people are saying that the militant organizations in Central Asian regions, and especially East Turkestan, in China, they will get a boost through this tremendous success of Taliban. And they're saying that this success of Taliban has given a new life to terrorist organizations like TTP and Al-Qaeda. Do you think it is right to consider the Taliban a terrorist organization? If it was a terrorist organization, as some people are claiming, would it be, having the control of the whole of Afghanistan at the moment?
Well, first of all, the term terrorist is a very politically loaded term. It's quite meaningless, actually. There's a lot of debate in the international relations literature on precisely what is terrorism or terrorist to start off with. It's often a politically loaded term that's used to discredit or delegitimize someone. Now, for example, one of the definitions given by the FBI of terrorism is illegitimate use of force to attain political objectives. Now, this leads us to two questions. Number one, who defines what legitimate and illegitimate force is? Second question would be political objectives. Now, for example, even if you say that I want Islamic law to play a role in governance, that's a political objective. There's nothing negative about a political objective. So this is a very loaded term, and it's quite meaningless. And in the case of Taliban has been accepted as a stakeholder. So, this question of terrorism in the context of Taliban is, it's not even valid. Regarding the first part of, I think, where you started from, again, as I said in the beginning, it depends on which perspective you're looking at it from. So, for example, if you're looking at it from a security perspective, in the context of Pakistan, the TTP at the moment is going to assess how the Afghan Taliban responds to, for example, this is not the post 9/11 scenario where Afghanistan and Pakistan was being viewed as a single war theater, not just by the United States, but also by Al-Qaeda, by the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban. And from a strategic point of view, it just made sense because all the NATO supply, from vehicles to ammunition to the adult diapers, were going to Afghanistan through Pakistan, from either the Chaman border or through the Turkmen border. So when the NATO supply was being targeted in Pakistan, it was being targeted by primarily the TTP in Khyber Agency, and it was benefiting the Afghan Taliban. And if you recall, when Hakimullah Mahsood, the TTP chief at that time, was killed in a drone strike, there was a message released from Shahamat website, which was the official Taliban website at the time, Afghan Taliban website, in which they offered condolences. So, first of all, what's happened is that the Pakistani state created a certain narrative to delegitimize the Afghan Taliban, and they repeated it so much that many of the policy makers actually started believing in that. The narrative that somehow Afghan Taliban and Pakistani Taliban have nothing in common. Somehow, the TTP is just a proxy of India or Afghanistan and so forth and so on. Now, when you have asymmetrical warfare, what happens is that you can get state actors who try and exploit the situation. So, for example, Pakistan provides a degree of support to, let's say, the Khalistan movement, even if it's moral support. That's the case with Kashmiris as well. Now, if India was to come along and say that, oh no, there's nothing local about this Khalistan movement, it's a Pakistani proxy, that would be factually incorrect. Similarly, for Pakistan to say that the Pakistani Taliban are just somehow an Indian creation, that's factually wrong. You can have state actors trying to exploit the situation. So, for example, Afghanistan would come along and say, and that's been the case with people like Amrullah Saleh, who've been saying that Afghan Taliban are just a Pakistani proxy. Well, that's not really true. It's a local group which has had support from Pakistan in varying degrees, in the same way as the TTP has been supported by TTP has received support from Afghanistan post Hamid Karzai setup. Why? Well, Afghan Taliban saw strategic backyard in Pakistan. Pakistani Taliban saw strategic backyard in Afghanistan, and both of them were benefiting each other. When Pakistani Taliban was attacking the NATO forces in Khyber Agency, that was benefiting the Afghan Taliban. So, we have to understand the linkages, number one. Number two, regarding your question about Central Asia, having spoken to some 150 different commanders and fighters from various organizations in Afghanistan and in Pakistan's tribal areas, particularly in North Waziristan. I've lived in these areas for quite some time. I've been told by numerous people, especially second-tier leadership of some of these organizations, that Mullah Omar had promised the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, at that time its leader was Tahir Yaldashev, he had been promised that once the Taliban gained strength, they would provide them with support. That was the case with East Turkestan Islamic movement as well. That was, they were also offered assurances. But what's happened post 9/11 and after the collapse of the first Taliban administration, having fought for 20 years and having discovered some of the political realities, that the Afghan Taliban has now become quite pragmatic. And the Afghan Taliban has actually moved on from some of its ideas of the past. So, for example, the Afghan Taliban now understands that if it seeks international legitimacy, then there are certain things that it cannot do. And that includes providing support to ETIM, providing support to TTP, providing support to IMU or any of these groups. So I think the Afghan Taliban would not want to risk that. It would not want to risk providing support to any of these organizations, because it now wants to act like a state actor, not like a non-state actor. That's something we have to take into account.
All right. So you are saying that a narrative was created in Pakistan about the good Taliban and the bad Taliban. What can we say about the current Afghan Taliban? Some are calling them Afghan Taliban 2.0. So what do you think? They are? Can we label them? Are they pro-Pakistan or they are anti-Pakistan? Because if previously TTP was a part of the Afghan Taliban, as you're saying, that was a narrative created by our government. So if I ask you in one word, can we describe them? Are they pro-Pakistan now or anti-Pakistan?
I mean, if you're to compare a potential Taliban government with, let's say, the previous administrations that we've seen in Afghanistan over the last 20 years in particular, then beyond the shadow of a doubt, a Taliban administration is going to be more pro-Pakistan. But let that not deceive anyone into thinking that the Afghan Taliban is not pursuing independent policies. The Afghan Taliban has its own policies, and to make the assumption that somehow it's just going to pursue a policy line given by Pakistan or by China or Russia or anyone for that matter, that's just going to be factually incorrect. So that's, I think we have to be very clear about one assumption there, number one. Number two, the Afghan Taliban is not going to be hostile to Pakistan. And we've got a precedent already. So, for example, in the past, when there was a Taliban government from 1996 to 2001, Pakistan's western borders, there was no military deployment along those borders. There was no threat. There was no attempt to try and or even claim that we're going to claim territory all the way up to Attock, and that belongs to some Greater Afghanistan or anything like that. So from Pakistan's security perspective, even the secular establishment in Pakistan realizes that Afghan Taliban is not a threat to Pakistan. So we have to strike a balance between making this assumption that somehow there's going to be the Taliban is going to pursue a policy dictated by Islamabad. That's not going to happen, especially considering the experience the Taliban has had in the past with Pakistan post 9/11. So I think that the Afghan Taliban is going to diversify its policy options.
Okay, that's understandable. They are not supposed to, follow Pakistan's line in any case. But what impact, is exactly going to have on Pakistan? But because someone was saying that now Pakistan is surrounded by authoritarian regimes on all sides in the form of China, Iran, and now in Afghanistan. And this is not going to be good for democracy in Pakistan. So what do you have to say about that?
Well, I'm not sure how to, if I should even be taking something like that seriously. What does it...
Yes, I agree with you.
If Pakistan is surrounded by authoritarian regimes, as whoever has put it that way, and what does that even mean? You've got, for example, almost every single ally of the United States in the Middle East and North Africa is an authoritarian regime. Some of the closest allies of Pakistan, those that have been investing the most in Pakistan, have been authoritarian regimes. So what does that even mean? I mean, how does that even affect anything? And democracy, as it seems, is such a contested topic anyway to start off with. And we can actually see, and there is ever-growing evidence that democracy and all the talk about democracy is being used as a foreign policy instrument by the neoliberals to often justify their wars and justify some of their aggressive actions. So to me, I wouldn't even take this talk about authoritarian regimes and democracy seriously, especially in a context like this.
You're right. First, if we are taking democracy seriously, first we have to decide what kind of way of governance is important, is practical and important for Pakistan in the light of Islam. We say that it is Islamic Republic of Pakistan, but we are stuck between these two systems of governance. Democracy, either it's democracy or it's dictatorship. But we never refer back towards our golden past. Okay, now I want to talk about, you said that the Taliban need to attain international legitimacy. So what are the mistakes that they need to avoid in order to gain international recognition?
Well, to start off with, since the last question was about democracy, I think we need to be very clear about one thing. The international establishment, and by that I mean the dominant West that enjoys the preponderant power at the moment, does not really care about democracy or so-called freedoms and so forth, which are very subjective, politically loaded constructs anyway. So, for example, the West continues to be in alliance with some of the most so-called authoritarian, and not just that, some of the most brutal regimes across the world. I mean, if you look at Central Asia itself, for example, in Uzbekistan, Islam Karimov was someone who even boiled some of his opposition to death, especially people who had been talking about Islam, activists who were not even resorting to the use of force or violence. They were brutally killed. And Islam Karimov had been one of the allies of many Western countries. So, the assumption that if you're democratic, you're going to be an ally, or if you're authoritarian, you're not going to be an ally, that's wrong to start off with. That's just not factually correct. All the allies of the West in the Middle East, almost all of them except for a couple maybe, are not even Shafi'i democracies. So, any discourse that tries to gain legitimacy from democracy or from liberal conceptions, I think we should be taking that very seriously to start off with. Now, in the context of Afghanistan, all of a sudden we hear people, including many Western journalists, coming from a very Western ethnocentrist point of view, somehow expressing their shock that, oh my God, we have a potential non-democratic regime about to prop up in Afghanistan, as if that is going to be, the determinant of legitimacy. This is just sheer hypocrisy. If the Taliban, for example, was to grant favorable conditions, market access, and basically toe the line of the West, then the Taliban could be Islam Karimov times 10, 10 times more brutal than Islam Karimov, and the West would happily accept it. The West does not have any problem accepting and legitimizing military dictatorships, as we've seen in Pakistan, as we've seen in Egypt, as we've seen in Algeria, as we've seen in Uzbekistan, much of the rest of Central Asia, and so forth and so on. So that's not even a criteria. So I think we really have to challenge some of these notions about democratic legitimacy and about what's expected. When you look at the Western discourse and when you engage in what's also known as discourse analysis, what you find is that, number one, the West does not accept any challenge to its hegemony. It sees Islam as a challenge to its hegemony, number two. And number three, it does not want Islam as a system. So if you talk about Islam in a ritualistic sense, if you're saying that, we want to pray and just fast and give charity and so forth, the West does not have any problem with that. They will build you a small prayer room at the White House at 10 Downing Street. You can go and pray tahajjud there. It's not going to be a problem for them. But the moment you start talking about Islam as a system, as a political system, economic system, social system, that's where they feel that the status quo is going to be challenged, and they're not going to accept that. So I think we have to bring in this dimension as well when we talk about the issues of legitimacy.
I completely agree with you that the West tries to gain legitimacy through democracy, and but we always forget that there is no real democracy in the United States itself, especially after the last elections, as the opposition was claiming that it was not free and fair, and we know what an important role the deep state plays in their politics. So we were talking about the negative things that people are saying about the Taliban. What I want to point out about the good things that we can learn from the Taliban. What are the lessons for Pakistan, and especially for Pakistani statesmen, for politicians? What can they learn from the Taliban?
When you talk about what lesson we can learn, it depends on which perspective you're looking at it from. So, for example, if you're looking at it from an Islamic perspective, the most important thing from the Islamic point of view is that we have to understand that Islam has two dimensions. It offers a system for us to govern in this world, and then there's the dimension of the hereafter. So the most important thing from Islamic point of view is that Allah's sovereignty is ensured, is that governance is done in accordance with Allah's laws. That's the most important thing. I could talk about, maybe you're expecting me to say that, we're already seeing this effect on the streets of Kabul, for example, where the Kabuli elites who used to roam around in their 4x4s, intimidating traffic policemen and being arrogant, not stopping, not listening to authority, that's changed. You might expect me to say stuff like that, and I can say stuff like that. But from Islamic point of view, the most important thing is the issue of sovereignty, where sovereignty lies. And from Islamic point of view, sovereignty lies with God. So that's the most important thing. That's the most important lesson for Pakistan. The case with Pakistan is that we have a constitution, and in the preamble of the constitution it says that no law shall be enacted in violation of Quran and Sunnah But in terms of the practical implementation, the Pakistan Penal Code, the Criminal Procedures Act, still has references to 19th century British laws, number one. Number two, we have a political system, an economic system that's not Islamic. So, I think Pakistan could learn to stop fooling itself, saying that we have this on paper and, we're like halfway there and this sort of stuff. It doesn't mean anything. Writing stuff on paper is meaningless unless it's acted upon. So I think that's probably the most important lesson we have to understand. The other lesson we have to understand is that I was old enough when the US invaded Afghanistan, 7th of October 2001. Those were my university days. I remember each and everything. I remember the arrogant statements of George W. Bush. I remember the statements from other Western capitals. And I remember the condition of many Muslims at that time who were saying that, we should just surrender. There is no way they're going to be able to deal with this overwhelming power of the NATO alliance. And I remember very well the statements coming from some of the leaders of resistance at that time. Statements like, you might have the watches, but we have the time. And statements like, there's on the one hand the statement of America, and then on the other hand there's the promise of God, and this was Mullah Omar, by the way, and I firmly believe in the promise of God, and we will fight no matter what it takes. So I remember all these statements, these details very well. So I think this is another lesson. There were some people in Pakistan at that time who just crumbled. On the one hand, they had been talking about Islam, and the next moment they were suddenly talking about national interest and how we didn't have an option, we had to do this. If you're looking at it from Islamic perspective, that's nonsense. If you're saying to me that let's be pragmatic, if you want to accept that secular pragmatic framework, then I could agree that, okay, Musharraf probably didn't have an option, he had to do this and blah, blah, blah. From a materialist, pragmatic point of view, that can make sense. But in that case, don't try and give your statement legitimacy from Islam, because the Islamic framework is very clear on this. Islamic perspective is very clear on this. And the Islamic stance was adopted and displayed by the Taliban at that time, who refused to hand over Osama bin Laden and who refused to crumble to any pressure. I remember when the then DGISI, Lieutenant General Mahmoud Ahmad, and Mufti Taqi Usmani, and many others, they went to Afghanistan and they tried to convince the Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden. I remember the statements from Mullah Omar at that time. So I think 20 years later, people who are my age or older than me, who've witnessed all the events, they remember the phase. I think, what comes to my mind is verses from Surah Al-Ahzab, where Allah describes the situation where the enemy was descending upon you from above and from below and from the sides. If you remember, the Medina had been surrounded during the Battle of Ahzab. And, there were hypocrites who were saying, let's go back. We cannot fight them. But Allah describes the condition of the believers at that time. He says that, من المؤمنين رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه فمنهم من قضى نحبه ومنهم من ينتظر وما بدلوا تبديلا. And among believers are those من المؤمنين رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه, who have lived according to the promise, the pledge they had made. And these verses were revealed when the fighting was actually taking place. So a number of them had been martyred. And Allah said that there are those who have fulfilled their pledge, i.e. they fought until martyrdom. And among those are those who are waiting to be martyred. وَمَا بَدَّلُوا تَبْدِيلًا. But they did not turn back on their promise, on their pledge. So in the context of Pakistan, Surah Al-Ahzab, what happened after, started happening, the Shock and No campaign, October 7, 2001. Fast forward to today, 31st of August 2021. Read chapter 33 of the Quran, and if Allah is giving you the chance to repent, then we should do that. We should feel ashamed of of our behavior. So, this I have a very serious issue with people trying to adopt pragmatic approaches and seeking to legitimize them through Islam. If you want to adopt a secular approach, then don't try and fool the people by, claiming that, by reciting a few verses of the Quran and saying that, trying to give the impression that that's somehow being legitimized by Islam. Don't do that. If you want to pursue a pragmatic course, do that, but don't lie. Don't give the impression that that's coming from Islam. The Islamic position post 9/11 was very obvious. Those people who betrayed that position, we know who they are. And we need to, look into ourselves as well, where we stood at that time. I remember people, even some religious people, saying at that time, there's no way we're going to, these Taliban and Al-Qaeda with their limited capacity is going to be able to deal with them. And here we have the results. So, I think it's our hypocrisy, it's our desire not to come out of our comfort zones, not to upset our social mobility opportunities, that we basically adopt a materialistic, pragmatic course while trying to bring in some Islamic jargon to deceive people and to legitimize our non-Islamic actions.
Sovereignty belongs to Allah. Well said, there is no doubt about it, and you have given a beautiful example from the Quran. Jazakallah khair for that. I have some questions now which people have been sending me. This Osman Shihab Saab is asking, what kind of government system the Taliban are coming up with? What's your guess?
I think the way it's going to be is this: they're going to have a consultative body in the same way as the Afghan Taliban has been operating. So, they've got a Majlis Shura within the Taliban consisting of scholars and people of technical expertise. So, for example, those with who have expertise in military affairs, those who have expertise in dealing with media and so forth and so on. There's going to be a expanded shura, and then they are probably going to have technocrats in certain positions. That's my guess based on some of the statements that have been coming out, number one. And when you sort of put them together with Taliban's statement that they're going to operate within the Sharia framework, then, it doesn't seem that there's going to be a sort of a parliamentary system in any way. But they're going to try and make it inclusive, so they're probably going to have representation from, from different ethnic groups, from the Shias, and so forth. We've already been seeing Taliban holding meetings with some Shia leaders from Bamiyan, and so forth and so on. So I think they're going to try and make it inclusive to muster that broad support. But in terms of exactly how they're going to operate, I think ultimately the policy direction is going to be coming from a shura body that they're going to set up. It's not going to be on a parliamentary democracy model in any way. But I think the outcome will depend on, for example, there's a standoff at the moment with the forces of Ahmad Massoud. I think the Taliban would probably want to delay any direct confrontation there, try and constitute an inclusive government, try and get some legitimacy. So, for example, we've seen a lot of engagement with Ankara. There's been a lot of engagement with Islamabad. The Chinese have been there. The Russians have been there. I think the Taliban is going to try and say that, okay, we have a government here that's inclusive. It's not going to be a parliamentary system, but it's a representative system, and try and garner de jure support, at least from a few states. And then later on, if they feel that Ahmad Massoud, for example, is becoming a serious challenge, then they might resort to dealing with it. But at the moment, I think their calculation is that those people who are holed up around Panjshir are not really a threat. They're contained in that valley. But I think the challenge for Taliban at the moment is that, if you look at the mainstream Western media and you do discourse analysis, it's clear that the primary objective is to any role for Islam. That's the Western objection. And, they tend to package that in their in their supposed concern for women's rights, for rights for minorities and so forth. But I think you just have to look at the history, and that debunks any claims of their concern for the rights of women or minorities. They're very happy in a consumer society. They're happy with market access in Afghanistan, and they won't care about rights. We've seen that in Central Asian states, for example, where people have been boiled to death just because they demanded Islam by Islam Karimov. So I think this political correctness, that confines us to a Western-defined framework of discussion, I think we have to break that. I think we have to very clearly establish the reasons that the West opposes, and I'm talking about any role of Islam in the public space. To West, that's unacceptable. So, for example, you can have Ikhwan al-Muslimin embracing Schumpeterian democracy and having competition, but the West is going to reject Ikhwan al-Muslimin coming into power through the ballot, having a system of Schumpeterian democracy, but the West would reject that because if they feel that they want to fundamentally change the system from a secular order to an Islamic order, they're going to oppose that. For example, if you look at the case of Turkey, when Professor Najmuddin Erbakan's party was banned, the Constitutional Court in Turkey had maintained that even though they had come to power through the parliamentary route, that they were basically a threat to secularism. And the European Court of Human Rights upheld that decision. So I think it's very clear what the objection is. And that objection is to Islamic governance. You can have the name Islam, but if underneath that you have a neoliberal order and you embrace liberal democracy, you can call it Islam or you can call it Islam times 2. That's fine. If they see any order that potentially threatens the status quo, the dominant ideology, then they're not going to accept that. I think the sooner Muslims realize this, and the sooner Muslims come out of this political correctness and say things as they are, the better it will be for us, inshallah.
I completely agree with you that this political correctness is nothing but hypocrisy. Now we have a question from someone, Maulana Fazlur Rahman Fans, handle on Twitter, and he's asking if they establish the Islamic system in Afghanistan, how it's going to impact Pakistan. I think we have already discussed this to some extent.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief. I think one of the impact is going to be, already, for example, if you look at the Pakistani social media, even though it's questionable how reflective the Pakistani social media is of the Pakistani society at large, especially, for example, the rural areas. Also, we have to look at another factor that, there is overwhelming support on the Pakistani social media for Afghan Taliban, but you've got two types of people. You've got those people who are supporting Taliban out of an ideological conviction, Islamic ideological conviction. And then you've got those even secular Pakistani nationalists who are supporting the Afghan Taliban because they see the Afghan Taliban as not a threat to Pakistan, especially when you compare them to the previous administrations in Afghanistan. The Afghan nationalist administrations that were talking about taking territory all the way to Attak and so forth.
They see them as Pashtun, I think.
Predominantly Pashtun. Obviously, Pashtun constitute the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. The point is that I'm not sure if social media reflects accurately. But back to the original question, how it's going to impact Pakistan. If we were to judge by what we see on the social media, I think what we're seeing is that again, I'm using the term Islamist in quotation marks because, it carries certain political connotations. From Islamic point of view, every Muslim is supposed to be an Islamist. There is no separation of church and state in Islam. This is not something that was, this concept of Islamic governance is not something that was started by Osama bin Laden or Abdullah Azzam or by Sayyid Qutb or by Ibn Taymiyyah. this goes all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ. This is very clear from the Quran. So, this Orientalist imposition, I think we have to reject that. But if we are to judge by looking at the social media, then again, quote unquote, the Islamists are feeling very emboldened in Pakistan. They're feeling very assertive. And that's one thing. So, they're speaking out openly. They're engaged in tabligh, in preaching, calling people to the Islamic system and so forth and so on. The other impact, I think, is going to be many people. Remember the 6 approaches we've discussed in the past, the 6 different opinions on how Islam is to be established. I think what's going to happen as a result of Afghan Taliban's victory is that those people who had been talking about the parliamentary approach, for example, I think their narrative is going to be weakened. And those people who are talking about either a hybrid approach or those people who are talking about the importance of hard power, their narrative is going to be strengthened. So I think this is something we have to remember, and this ties in with what I said in the beginning about the security perspective of the Pakistani state, how they are closely monitoring the TTP at the moment because they feel that the TTP might feel emboldened. But again, that's something we've discussed already, so I'm not going to repeat that.
Okay, all right. You said that the hybrid approach and governance is going to be weakened, and the Islamists are feeling emboldened by the success of the Taliban. Now we have another question by Osama Rizwan, and he's asking, when will Pakistan recognize the Afghan Taliban?
I think Pakistan is waiting for China to make a move. Because Pakistan probably feels, I think that the calculation in Islamabad at the moment is that if Pakistan rushes into recognizing a Taliban government, then that could basically create problems for Pakistan, especially if international recognition doesn't follow. But there's another thing. Pakistan is also waiting for the formation of a government in Afghanistan. Remember, there's no government at the moment. The Taliban has been talking about constituting a government. We're still waiting for that announcement. Now, my understanding is that over the last few days, there have been a series of meetings in Kandahar that have been chaired by Mullah Haibatullah Akhundzada, the supreme leader of the Afghan Taliban. And that government is going to be announced probably within the next couple of days or so, possibly, because a number of senior officials from the Taliban political office are currently in Kabul. They were attending those meetings in Kandahar. So I think once that setup has been announced, then obviously there's going to be the stage of some countries, for example, deciding whether it's inclusive or not. Because, they have to support and substantiate their move. So Turkey, for example, might do that. We've had statements if you look at the statements from President Erdogan, from the Turkish defense minister and others, Turkish foreign minister, they've said that they're going to look at whether it's an inclusive setup or not. Turkey has a number of interests in Afghanistan. Turkey has substantial investments. Turkey wants to play a role in the reconstruction. Taliban has called for that as well. So I think many countries at the moment are waiting for the constitution of a government, and then there's going to be the phase of recognition, and that's where we're probably going to witness a domino effect. So one country recognizes them, and then other countries jump on board. So I think it's probably just a matter of a few days now, considering the meetings that have been taking place in Kandahar.
All right. Now we have another question, and it's from Meher Muhammad Bilal, and he's asking, Pakistan let the American troops, pass from here, and what do the Taliban think about that? I think he's talking about the safe passage that we let them through here, and because the Kabul airport was shut down. I think he's talking about that.
I'm not sure which stage he's talking about. For example, is he talking about Pakistan providing support to the coalition?
I think he's talking about the American troops who have been here in Pakistan for the last 2 nights, I think. Now they're going to leave.
Okay, there's been no official statement from Taliban on that, but my view is that the Afghan Taliban is not really going to have an issue with the Americans making a stopover in Pakistan, because the Pakistani, for example, earlier today I talked to one official in Pakistan and I asked him, what the reasons were and what details he had. And he said that one of the reasons behind that was to ensure timely evacuation. He said that it was easier for the Americans to quickly just pack up and move across into Pakistan and then leave from there. If that's the only point, then the Afghan Taliban won't have an issue with that. They're already celebrating a decisive victory. The Americans have left even before the deadline expired. But I think there are a number of unanswered questions. So, for example, there are some reports suggesting that the Americans are going to be stationed in Pakistan for a month. Why are they there? Are they there to, in some sort of quarantine before returning to their countries? Or, why are they there? Initially, they were stationed in Peshawar, and then they've been moved to Islamabad. And the same official, who's very well, placed, he comes from the power center in Pakistan. I'm sure people can understand what that means. He said that initially they were given accommodation in Peshawar, but they objected. They said that, this is not up to scratch, the accommodation. And now they've been moved to Islamabad in accommodation which is at least sort of 4-star standard. So, there are a number of unanswered questions at the moment. Why are they going to be stationed there for? How long are they going to be stationed in Pakistan for? What exactly are the reasons? Pakistan may feel that it's good for soft power projection, but soft power projection is pretty useless unless you get something tangible out of it. Is Pakistan benefiting economically, for example, by hosting those Americans? Is Pakistan, taking advantage and getting concessions for the PIA, for the Pakistan International Airlines, for instance? What is it that Pakistan is obtaining from this? Soft power, saying that, it's going to help us with our soft power, it's meaningless. You have to get something tangible. I mean, at the moment, I've put aside Islamic point of view. Let's put that aside for the time being. Even if you're thinking from a very pragmatic point of view, even if you're thinking as a rational economic actor, what is it? Is there something tangible that Pakistan is getting from it that hasn't been made clear? And I think it's not a good idea, considering the situation that we are witnessing in the region at the moment, for Pakistan to not show transparency in this regard. Pakistan needs to be transparent. The Pakistani leadership needs to take the public into confidence about, the reasons for the Americans to be stationed there. I mean, why do the Americans have to come to Pakistan? Normally they go to Germany, to one of the largest NATO bases. They have a layover there, and then they continue their onward journey to the US, crossing the Atlantic. They tend to go to Germany. Why are they here? I mean, as far as the case of Afghans is concerned, we can understand that maybe the Americans want, or the other Western countries want the Afghans to be in Pakistan, go through the vetting process, the application, and then be granted asylum in different countries. But what about the Americans? Or is it the case that these are going to be the people who are going to be carrying out the vetting? But I don't think the soldiers are going to be doing that vetting. That is going to be done by people other than American soldiers. That will be intelligence operatives, people from the State Department, and so forth and so on. So again, your average Joe, the soldier, he's not going to be doing the vetting. So why is he in Pakistan? That's something Pakistan needs to clarify.
Okay, I get from you, Hassan, that you're saying that this soft power projection that we are so much concerned about, it's not a big deal, and it's not going to be very advantageous for Pakistan in any case. And now we have a question from Izhar Ahmed, and he's asking, how will Taliban cover Western media propaganda? Might be after 2 or 3 years of their rule, they may accuse them by the same criteria like 9/11, Osama bin Laden, and may attack Afghanistan with more powerful agenda. So I think basically what he's asking is how will Taliban handle the Western media propaganda?
I think this is going to be a perpetual struggle. This is not the end of it. This is basically just a transition to another phase. Since we are speaking as Muslims, let's be very clear about what Allah has said in the Quran. Because, sometimes we try and analyze things from a realist perspective, from a international political economy perspective, and so forth and so on. Let's just bring in the Islamic perspective on this as well, very, very clear. Why is there confrontation between the West, or the dominant power at the moment, and Islam? Well, Allah says in the Quran, وَلَا يَزَالُونَ يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ حَتَّى يَرُدُّوكُمْ عَنْ دِينِكُمْ إِنِ اسْتَطَاعُوا. And they will never stop fighting you until they can turn you away from your religion if they can. وَلَنْ تَرْضَ عَنْكَ الْيَهُودُ وَلَا النَّصَارَى حَتَّى تَتَّبِعَ مِلَّتَهُم. The Jews and the Christians will never be happy with you until you follow their ways. The Quran's view on this is very clear. This is basically about the sovereignty. Is there going to be sovereignty of God or sovereignty for mankind? We are seeking sovereignty of God. Some people have a problem with that, because when you have sovereignty of God, then many of their interests are going to suffer. Their exploitation is going to be contained and curtailed. They don't want that. So, it does not suit the elite to be challenged, for the status quo to be revised. Islam is not it's not a ritualistic pacifist system that tolerates oppression and any status quo. This is what Rand Corporation would like Islam to be. They would like to confine Islam to a set of rituals. But Islam, as the Quran itself describes it, is a deen. It's not a mazhab, it's a deen. It's a way of life that encompasses politics, economics, the social realm, everything. So they are going to resist. If the Taliban was to announce tomorrow that, okay, we're going to become a totalitarian regime, but secular in nature. However, we will give you favorable conditions and market access. The West is going to embrace them very happily. They're not going to have a problem with that. The West doesn't have issues with authoritarian or totalitarian regimes as long as its interests are protected. We see that across the GCC. All the most loyal allies of America are non-democracies. And the Americans don't care about that because, they are fulfilling the American objectives. So, let's not be deceived about any assumption that it's about democracy versus authoritarianism or something like that. The West does not want to see Islam implemented as a system. It's simple as that. All this talk about women's rights and minority rights, these are just foreign policy instruments. All you have to do is, I would recommend a book called Deterring Democracy. It's not even written by a Muslim. It's written by Noam Chomsky. He talks about how the West, when it suits it, conveniently ignores huge human rights violations, by its own standards. And when it suits it, it can make any frivolous excuse to invade a country, as it's done in some Central American states. So, I'd recommend that book, Deterring Democracy by Noam Chomsky. We've just got so many examples in the 20th century alone of how the West has behaved and conducted itself. So I think Muslims need to be very, very clear about this and not be duped about human rights or democracy or any of that stuff. I think we really have to deconstruct these terms and really understand how these terms are used as a foreign policy instrument to promote a Western ethnocentrist agenda.
All right. Now we have a question from Malcolm X, and he wants to talk about the powers of Sharia in Pakistan, and he's asking about the role of scholars like Mufti Taqi Usmani, and he's saying that on the one hand he's celebrating the success of the Afghan Taliban, and on the other hand he is just happy with the way we have democracy in Pakistan. So what do you have to say to that?
Okay, this is a very difficult question. The thing is, we have to go back to the six approaches I've discussed in previous sessions. So, for example, those people who talk about the implementation of an Islamic system, how there are at least 6 different approaches. Those who talk about implementation of Islam through participation in parliamentary politics, those who talk about the use of force, those who propose the hybrid model, those who talk about intellectual struggle followed by seeking nusra. We've discussed the 6 different approaches. So I think this is where we have to show a bit of flexibility. when there is valid difference of opinion on an issue, Islam does require that we show flexibility. So, on any matter on which there is difference of opinion, we should try and not be too rigid and impose our understanding on a particular aspect of methodology or strategy. In the context of Pakistan, we have some scholars who, for example, believe that at the moment, in the given circumstances, perhaps Muslims have to participate in the parliamentary system as well, in a parliamentary or sort of Schumpeterian democracy, and gain leverage out of that participation. This is down to strategy. There are some who believe that this is the time to engage in intellectual struggle. There are those who are talking about using force. There are those who are talking about a hybrid approach and so forth. So, a lot of this stems from these realities and from these differences over strategy and over methodology. So we have to understand that. The other thing we have to understand is, when you're talking on the social media, whether you're speaking with your real identity or whether you've created a sort of nameless account, it's very easy for you to say certain things. But when it comes to people who actually have to look at the repercussions and they have to look at things from 1,000 different angles, things are a bit more complicated for them. So this is something we have to understand.
It's not that simple for them. That's what you're saying.
It's not so simple. Sometimes it's easy for people on the social media to make the assumption that, they don't have the courage to do that. It's not just about courage. It's actually about strategy as well. You have to understand that there are differences of opinions on strategy, and where there is valid difference of opinion, Islam requires a degree of flexibility. You cannot impose your strategic position on someone else. And I'm speaking from Islamic point of view. I'm not talking about, I'm not adopting some classical liberal position and coming from there. I'm coming from an Islamic, orthodox Islamic position.
Yes.
Where there is room for difference over strategy. Muslims need to learn to be flexible and tolerant in that regard, and not try and impose a particular strategy or view on other Muslims.
True.
Sometimes, you can have different people who go for different approaches out of the 6 approaches we've discussed, and they could be complementing each other in terms of the output. They can be strategic alliances. They could be providing leverages. You look at some organizations, for example, that are operating in a hybrid mode. So they might have presence in parliaments in certain countries. They also have hard power. The hard power component leverages those in the parliament, and those in the parliament tend to leverage those with the hard power. So, these are strategic aspects of the bigger picture.
All right, Hassan, the session...
This is a complex topic.
It's going to get, the session was supposed to end at 11, and we still have a few more questions, so I'm going to hurry up and, ask them. And this is someone, Jam Hashim, and he's asking, will China be the first country to recognize Taliban government?
It's difficult to say who's going to be the first country to recognize. I think countries realize that once the government has been formed, and once they have a reason to justify their action of recognizing, certainly de jure recognition of the Taliban-led government, then they understand that they would stand better chances of obtaining more lucrative reconstruction contracts if they rush into recognizing the Taliban. So, we have a number of contenders. There's Pakistan, there's Turkey, there's China, there's Russia. There are a number of contenders. I think it's difficult to say who's going to be the first one.
All right. Now there's a question from Aisha Yusufzai, and she's saying that I am a strong supporter of Islamic law implementation, not only in Afghanistan, but in the Muslim world. But I have heard that the Taliban are not dealing well with the Salafis and have arrested Salafi scholars, which is really disappointing, even though I am Hanafi myself. But I have respect for all the Muslim scholars. Another thing which is attracting world media is that no women are seen in any of the meetings so far.
Okay, regarding the first question, the Taliban of the 90s, they were pretty rigid in certain matters. That's not the case with the Taliban today. I'm saying that, speaking with authority, having met many of them in Afghanistan, having met many of them in Qatar. Number one, post 9/11 in particular, and even before 9/11, they had a lot of interaction with Egyptian scholars, with Saudi scholars and figures. And the fact that they worked so closely with Al-Qaeda, that did actually have an impact on their thinking. So even on small issues of jurisprudence, for example, when it comes to the use of camera, you can see that the Taliban's position has changed on that. On the issue of the so-called suicide bombing, you might recall that once upon a time Taliban was opposed to that. But that position also changed after their interaction, in particular with the Egyptian camp. So the Taliban have actually evolved. They've evolved intellectually. They've evolved in their position on Islamic jurisprudence. They've evolved as far as their strategy is concerned. So I don't think that's really going to be an issue. And I think one of the things that I saw in Afghanistan, especially in the early 2000s, was this harmony that existed between Hanafis and Ahl Hadith camps and so forth and so on. I think as far as the leadership is concerned, certainly they've moved beyond that. But at the very low level, obviously you can have people who've never been exposed to anything other than the ideas they hold. You might find them a bit rigid. So for example, in Kabul there have been some cases where like the very low-level Taliban fighters might not know how to interact with people, with the public at large, because some of them have seen nothing but war. So that's one thing we have to take into account. But that's not the case with the leadership. When you go and talk to the leadership, when you go and you talk to Anas Haqqani, you see the sophistication. Number one. As far as the second question is concerned regarding women's participation, number one, I think when we question participation and gender roles, many of our notions are influenced by the dominant Western sort of ideas, the Western notions of gender relations and so forth and so on. When it comes to Taliban or many of the Islamic groups, for example, people who've been socialized in the West, even many Muslims, they come with this Western ethnocentrist, Eurocentric approach, and they're like, oh my God, they're putting the men and women in separate rooms, for example. Because their thought process has been socially engineered by the dominant Western notions. So they fail to realize that the Islamic approach is different. I mean, Islam is not stopping women from participating. I mean, whether it comes to education or consulting and so forth and so on. In the history of Islam, especially when Muslims were practicing Islam, no Muslim woman had to adopt a male name to teach or to write. No Muslim woman had to use the name George Eliot to write a book, because otherwise it would not have been accepted. That was the case in the West as early as 150 years or so, where we had these issues. In Islam, one of the most prominent scholars from the first generation has been Hazrat Aisha radiallahu anha. She was a teacher to some of the greatest and the most knowledgeable Sahaba. So we don't have these issues. What happens is that the West has a certain experience in terms of its exploitation of women. Remember that not too long ago in the West, there were even debates if women had souls or not. So there was this huge exploitation of women in the West. No right to inheritance, no right to divorce, no right to education. Forget about the franchise, and there were so many issues. So when the early waves of feminism started, they were a reaction to this exploitation of women. There is no denying that there was huge exploitation of women. So we saw a reaction to that, and then obviously the different waves of feminism moved on, and where we are today, where we are. But from an Islamic point of view, what we have to understand is that Islam is coming as a comprehensive system. So you can't just pick one aspect of Islam and ignore the rest of the system where it fits in. I'll give you an example. There's a huge issue of infidelity in non-Islamic societies. So, husband and wife cheating on each other. It's a very common issue in many Western societies. And, they don't know how to control it. What the Creator has done, what Allah has done, knowing the psychology, physiology of men and women, Allah has placed checkpoints and restrictions at points so that we don't even end up doing that. So, for example, Allah says in the Quran, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا, do not approach adultery or fornication. Allah is not saying don't do zina, Allah is saying don't even approach it. So, what sort of restrictions did Allah put in place? Well, Allah put in place restrictions on physical contact, no shaking hands with non-mahram, for example. Allah's put restrictions on khalwa, not being alone with a non-mahram man or woman. Allah has ordered men and women to lower their gaze, not to deliberately look at what's haram for them to look at, right? So, checkpoints have been placed. So, I can understand that we've been conditioned in such a way that, we make certain assumptions without even thinking about them. But this is where we have to understand that many of the expectations are basically rooted in secular liberal ideals and secular liberal interpretations of what emancipation ought to be. Islamic conception is different.
All right, Hazrat, you have explained it very well, and it's very important for us as Muslims to know about the teachings of Islam, not just know about them, to live according to them. We have a few more questions. This is from Talha Khalid, and he's saying, what is the relation between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda? Is Al-Qaeda still in Afghanistan? And what is the difference between the ideology of ISIS and Taliban?
Okay, these are two questions. As far as Al-Qaeda and Taliban are concerned, Al-Qaeda and Taliban had very close collaboration. Post 9/11 as well, it was Al-Qaeda that was basically the strategic mind in terms of how the asymmetrical warfare is to be fought. So, for example, it was key figures from Al-Qaeda who suggested that Pakistan should be viewed as a strategic backyard. Let the Americans go ahead with the shock and awe campaign. And once the Americans send in the boots on the ground, that's when they should be ambushed and so forth. So, they work very closely, Al-Qaeda and Taliban, post 9/11 in particular. We have many, many statements from the most prominent Afghan Taliban leaders, people like Mullah Dadullah, on tape, his interview to Al Jazeera, for example, where he's speaking very highly of Al-Qaeda and so forth and so on. So, if you want to speak factually, you can't deny it. I mean, what happens is sometimes states create narratives just to justify their own objectives, but that doesn't change reality. The reality is that Al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban have been hand in glove, and that's the case with the Pakistani Taliban as well. So, is Al-Qaeda still present in Afghanistan? Well, remember, there are those people who had been in Afghanistan since the 1980s, who fought against the Soviets. They lived there, they've raised their generations, they've married in Afghanistan and so forth and so on. I think what the Afghan Taliban is going to do is, the Afghan Taliban is not going to expel them, but they're going to say that, you're not going to threaten any other country. And based on the Al-Qaeda literature that has been, coming recently, especially from AQIS, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, I think Al-Qaeda is probably going to review its strategy and not adopt the strategies it adopted in Bamiyan, for example, with the Buddhas, to try and isolate the Taliban. I think Al-Qaeda is not going to do that. As far as the second question is concerned, difference between Daesh and Taliban, well, there's substantial difference. To start off with, I think it's important to give a bit of a historical overview as well, because, I see many people coming up with these nonsensical conspiracy theories that, completely disregard the historical account of how what we call Daesh emerged. So I'm just going to, its roots actually go back, quite far behind, but I'm going to start from Iraq. So from 2003, US invasion of Iraq, what happens is that people like Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, they get together, they gather forces, they start fighting the Americans. The Americans prop up they tip the balance in the favor of the Shias in Iraq. Remember, this is post Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein obviously had kept the his Ba'athist administration had suppressed some of the groups, and among those were the Shias who Saddam Hussein had suppressed, the Shias, the Kurds, and so forth. So when Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, when he emerges and he's confronted with a new reality, where, for example, he sees that the balance of power is tipping in the favor of the Shias in Iraq, that leads to confrontations. We witness a group known as the Mujahideen Shura Council emerge. This was basically made up of tribal leaders from various tribes in Iraq, especially around Tikrit and some other areas. They basically provide support to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Later on, he declares, they go on to declare what was called ISI, not the Pakistani ISI, Islamic State of Iraq. They declare that. ISI then evolves, and it moves into the Syrian conflict, when the ISI leadership, not Pakistani ISI, again I repeat, so that I'm not misquoted, the Islamic State of Iraq sends some people to Syria to basically become part of that conflict. And later on, when they remove that border, they say that we reject the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and we're combining these two territories, and they declare Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. So ISI becomes ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Later on, about 2 years later, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declares that they've evolved into a caliphate. So they say that we're no longer ISIS, we're just the IS, the Islamic State. Now, that Islamic State, so-called Islamic State, then, ends up with chapters in different places. So, for example, there was the Islamic State of Khorasan province. Khorasan was viewed as a province, so basically this Afghanistan, Pakistan area. That's where there was this pledge of allegiance. So there was someone called Hafiz Saeed Khan, who was the first leader of ISKP. He was joined by people like Shahidullah Shahid, who was once upon a time the spokesman of the TTP. This was after Ahsanullah Ahsan. He joins them as well, and there were loads of people from Orakzai agency who joined them. Now, this is a very, very quick historical, basically, rundown of how it emerged, because, to embrace conspiracy theories and just put everything on America, this is an American conspiracy, and it's just so nonsensical, and it does not help. Because when you disregard realities, that affects your strategizing. So it's really important to embrace the facts, even if they go against your ideational interests. That's the whole point. We shouldn't try to shape facts or realities around our ideational interests. We have to acknowledge the facts and then strategize accordingly. This is something I think Muslims really have to learn to do. Anyway, regarding theological differences, one of the issues with ISKP and IS in general, which obviously has disintegrated now in all practical terms, is the issue of takfir. They are very, very quick to declare takfir on others. I'm actually a victim. I've got a number of takfirs in my DM as well, by the way. Takfir is when you declare a Muslim a kafir. So I've been takfired a few times by Daeshi boys. They have done takfir on the Taliban as well, and they've attacked the Taliban. And obviously the Taliban has fought back and really contained them, especially in Kunar and in Nangarhar, where once upon a time ISKP had been becoming pretty strong. So, it's not petty differences on jurisprudence. So, for example, many of the people, if you look at Al-Qaeda, for instance, Al-Qaeda has Hanbalis, Al-Qaeda has Shafi'is, it has Hanafis, it has Ahl Hadith and others. But there was no such issue of takfir with the Taliban. With Daesh, the case is different. The Daesh has done takfir on Al-Qaeda. Handle that. So, the biggest issue is the issue of takfir, of Daesh making takfir on everyone, basically, other than those who've pledged allegiance to it. And this is why Daesh regards it as legitimate to target and deliberately kill non-combatants. which from an Islamic point of view is absolutely unacceptable. Islam is very strict when it comes to the rules of engagement, the rules of combat. I would like to remind you that the Prophet ﷺ, the instructions he used to give his militaries, and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and the Khulafa, they continued with this practice. So Islam does not allow, number one, the killing, the deliberate targeting of non-combatants. It does not allow the killing of non-combatant women. It does not allow the killing of or targeting of children, old people, monks, religious people. Islam prohibits targeting places of worship. Islam does not allow you to contaminate water supply. Islam does not allow you to burn plants and food supplies. I'm not a moderate Muslim of the RAND Corporation. I'm a very orthodox Muslim. I'm, alhamdulillah, speaking very unapologetically, but this is the Islamic position. The moderate Muslims would like you to just suffer and remain subservient. No, that's not Islam. Islam is a way of life. It's very practical. Islam is what came to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Islam is what was given to Prophet Jesus, to Prophet Moses, to Abraham, to everyone before them. This is Islam. From Adam all the way to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This was Islam. It's the way of life. So, Daesh has been disregarding these things. And I've spent time in Syria, I've spent time in Afghanistan, I've seen these groups up close and personal. This takfir issue is it's a very casual thing for them. They'll just make takfir on you there and then. And as I said, I've got quite a few takfirs in my DM.
So basically what you're saying is that Daesh's ideology is very radically different from that of the Taliban, because the Taliban don't do takfir that easily.
If you were to take a very superficial look, you would say that, okay, they're talking about implementation of an Islamic system. The Taliban want an Islamic system. Al-Qaeda wants an Islamic system. But this issue of takfir is not to be taken lightly. Remember what happened in the time of Ali radiallahu anhu, Ali bin Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. How, for example, the Khawarij at the time, how they just went around declaring takfir on the issue of arbitration. And we actually find very similar arguments with Daesh today as well. Some of those arguments. I tend to avoid using labels. This is why I avoid calling someone a Khariji unless Islamic conditions are met. But certainly many of the habits of the Khawarij can be found in Daesh in terms of very quickly excommunicating Muslims and declaring people disbelievers and making their dam halal and so forth. This is a very serious theological issue. One of the problems we have, this is something Muslims have to resolve and deal with themselves. The problem is, on the one hand, we've got groups like Daesh who are very quick to make takfir. And then on the other hand, you've got RAND Corporation and Nixon Center and others who want to tell Muslims how Islam is, and how Islam is to be. They want to secularize Islam, which is not in the nature of Islam. And as I said again, this Western notion that, the terms like political Islam and Islam to start off with, this bifurcation, this is just nonsense. Throughout Islamic history, and again, anyone just, I say this to non-Muslim friends as well, if you just read the Quran, it's very clear that the Quran does not have the concept of separation of church or state, separation of politics from some spiritual domain. It's a system. So on the one hand, what happens is you've got a concerted effort by the West to try and secularize Islam, which they've been failing at doing. They've spent so much money, but they just fail at doing that. There's always resistance from the Muslims. And then this actually feeds into the narrative of groups like Daesh. And, they come along with the concept of Allah's Hakimiyya, which is rooted in the Quran. It's not something Daesh has come up with. So, when someone says sovereignty belongs to God, this is not something that Daesh has come up with, or Osama bin Laden came up with, or Sayyid Qutb came up with, or, Ibn Taymiyyah came up with. This is something rooted in the Quran. So when we get these two, from Islamic point of view, these two extremes, this actually makes the task difficult for Orthodox Muslims to deal with challenges like Daesh. So, many of these counterterrorism and de-radicalization programs are actually backfiring.
All right, I completely agree with you that the Muslims are stuck between the devil and the deep sea. On the one hand, they have these Khawarij, the Takfiri people. On the other hand, we have organizations which are trying to, secularize the Muslims. Few more questions. This is from Hasib Shah, and he's saying that is it possible that the relationship between Pakistan and Afghan Taliban will return to post 9/11 level?
I think he means pre-9/11.
Yeah, I think he means pre-9/11.
Yeah, it's possible, and the relations could actually be better because what's happened post 9/11 in particular, after the US imposed administrations in Kabul, what we saw was increased support for groups like the BLA, the Balochistan Liberation Army, a separatist group that seeks to basically break and separate Balochistan province and turn that into a state. These groups increased their support, and we saw many other groups basically finding a strategic backyard in Afghanistan, and these were groups that Pakistan viewed as anti-state. In the Taliban-led administration, that's expected to change. So I think we're probably, we could possibly even return to some of the policies that we saw earlier in terms of, there was a lot of free movement, policies had been relaxed. Already there's so much, relaxed movement across the Durand line. So I think there is scope for good relations. Also, when you take into account the fact that the Taliban is really behaving like a state actor, trying to act like statesmen and taking a fairly pragmatic approach as well in many regards, I think it could work really well. But obviously, when you look at the mainstream Western media, what we're seeing is such a Islamophobic narrative. I mean, I tweeted earlier today, I want to quickly read that. I tweeted that some are pushing an Islamophobic agenda in the garb of opposition to Taliban. Their real issue is with Muslims who challenge Western hegemony. From propaganda against Ottomans to today's constitutionally secular Turkey, Western ethnocentrism wants to dictate how Islam should be. We're seeing that. I mean, I engage with many Western journalist friends, and some of them, are good people, but a lot of the times they don't even realize that they're coming, they're sort of riding a very high horse, assuming a moral high ground for themselves, and they seem to think that the Western ethnocentrist view they're promoting and carrying forward is some sort of objective reality, some neutral ground that other journalists are to adopt. With many of them, as I've interacted with and, we've talked, and they seem to have accepted that, and, their behavior seemed to have changed, that haughtiness, that arrogance that was previously, basically coming from them in our discussions, that seemed to have changed. So, you have reasonable, good people everywhere. We need to interact with people. But there are those people who, even if they acknowledge this is happening, they have sometimes driven by racism, sometimes driven by other factors, they just assume. It's quite hilarious that, Muslims often hear that, they seek to impose their way of life on others. But, the West is doing precisely that. You're complaining about a suicide bomber going and blowing himself up, but somehow it becomes legitimate to use a B-52 or to drop the mother of all bombs and to wipe out entire families, entire weddings. Somehow that's legitimate use of force. Cultural colonialism is somehow acceptable when the West is doing that, assuming that its ideas, its values are somehow an objective reality that are to be imposed on people. That's the thought process. When you do that, when you're not willing to talk, you're not willing to engage, then that's going to lead to conflicts and confrontation. I think sensible people from all sides should get together and, have reasonable, honest discussions.
I completely agree with you, Hassan, on this. And now we have a question from Zaid Ali, and he's saying, is it not time for Pakistan to come to Sharia and laws of Islam when Afghanistan has already started processing it or approaching it? If not now, then when?
I mean, the simplest answer is yes, it's about time. But, there's a whole process. Islam is, number one, it's it's not something that you can shove down someone's throat. If you look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ, he engaged in a period of intellectual struggle. You can coerce someone into doing something, but the foundation of an Islamic state is taqwa, is the fear of God. And that's something which comes even when you're alone. People, when they see a speed radar, they quickly slow down. But the ideal position should be that even if there are no speed cameras, they should have this concern and regard for law, that they follow it, even if there's no traffic police or speed cameras. This is what Islam actually demands. That's the ideal position. So intellectual struggle is something that we have to engage in. The problem with Pakistan and other Muslim countries is that in the post-colonial setup, we've got really confused ideas. So, on the one hand, we talk about Islam, and on the other hand, we have not only embraced, but we've internalized the Westphalian system and the realities surrounding the Westphalian system. And we have accepted that as some sort of unchanging reality. There is, on the one hand, we talk about Ummah, and then on the other hand, we've got this secular nationalism, Pakistani nationalism, Turkish nationalism, Emirati nationalism, Afghan nationalism, whatever. There's a clear contradiction between these nationalisms and the concept of Ummah in Islam. But we're a really confused bunch. So the first thing that we need is clarity of thought. That clarity of thought does not come at gunpoint. That clarity of thought comes through intellectual struggle. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that if someone attacks you and invades you, you go and you preach to them. No, that's not the time for preaching. When someone comes and fight me, I'll kick that person's ass, frankly speaking. Literally. But, that's not the time for da'wah or tabligh when you're attacked. But some things happen in parallel. So, there's a time for hard power, there's a time for intellectual struggle, there's a time for both of them to go together, side by side. And this is not something, just confined to Islam. So, for example, if you look at the Marxist approaches, you find many commonalities in terms of the struggle. I think we have to understand some of these processes, the process of power transition, how intellectual struggle is to be done, how change is brought about in society. I think these are some things we really have to understand. But we are a really, really confused lot. We have a lot to do. There's a lot of intellectual work that has to be done. I mean, I'm, as part of my literature review, I'm trying to find works on the concept of transition of power, or the scope that Islam gives in terms of transition of power, especially in the current reality. In today's day and age, how is transition of power going to happen? How are we going to witness a transition from, let's say, the current liberal international economic order to an Islamic system? These things don't happen overnight, number one. These things don't happen with slogans and stuff. These things don't happen with just going up and blowing random, places and killing innocent people. This is not the Islamic way. We really have to understand what Islam is demanding of us. We've relegated the Quran just as a book for blessing or, for weddings or these sort of things, for rituals.
You're right, Hassan, that we are more focused on rituals, but we don't implement Islam in our lives. We need to focus more on that, and we cannot, and you're also right about that. We should not impose our values on others. Unfortunately, the West is doing the exact same thing. Okay, we have a question from Shahan Han, who says, what do you think about the demand of Islamic laws in Pakistan if they're implemented there in Afghanistan and are successful?
Okay, first of all, how are we going to gauge that? I mean, I received a question a few days ago. It was a very good question. I wanted to actually tweet a brief video on that, but I was pretty busy. The question was something along the lines that looking at the support for the Afghan Taliban on Pakistani social media, can we safely assume that there is huge demand for Islam in Pakistan? It was a very good question. Now, first of all, we have to evaluate, how representative the social media is of the Pakistani society, or any society, any Muslim society for that matter. Because, we've got all these fake accounts, troll accounts, all this stuff, number one. How is the rural Pakistan, for example, reflected on the Pakistani social media space? That's another question. The other thing you have to bear in mind is that on on the Pakistani social media, you've got two types of people supporting the Taliban. You've got those people supporting the Taliban who do so out of Islamic sort of ideological convictions. And then you've got those secular Pakistani nationalists supporting the Afghan Taliban because they see the Afghan Taliban as not a threat to Pakistan, which is a reality. I mean, if you compare that especially to the administrations we've had in Kabul over the last 20 years, who were sheltering BLA and various separatist organizations. So, for example, in the context of Turkey, it would be like a neighboring country providing shelter to the PKK terrorist organization, that sort of context. So you've got these two types of people supporting the Afghan Taliban in Pakistan. So the second group, the secular Pakistani nationalists, they want Sharia in Afghanistan because it serves Pakistan's national security interests, but they don't want Sharia in Pakistan. So when you go back to the original question of if there is demand, you have to work out how are we going to gauge that. Now, there was a Pew Research survey done in 2013 by Pew Research, and they asked the question about if people accept Sharia in their country. Now, the results were very interesting. In Afghanistan, this is a 2013 survey, you can find it on the Pew website. In Afghanistan, 99% of the participants of that survey said they supported Sharia. In Pakistan, that was 84%. In Turkey, that was 12%. In Azerbaijan, that was 8%. So, if this is to be some sort of an indicator, it can perhaps give you some indication of how much intellectual struggle is to be done. I've had many debates with, especially when I was living in Afghanistan, I've had debates with various groups, and especially those people who are, adopting the approach of using force. From a strategic point, put Islamic point of view aside for a second. Even from a strategic point of view, this is just ridiculous that you're just going to go around slaughtering people, trying to impose a system, any system that could be. It could be Islam, it could be Marxism, whatever. You have to create the ground. That requires intellectual struggle. So I think in the context of Pakistan, we have other challenges as well in Pakistan. For example, many people who say that they support Sharia, but their conception of Sharia is very limited. So they think Sharia is about just praying namaz, giving zakat, doing hajj. Different people have different conceptions of Sharia. But when you go to some businessman and you say, excuse me, you should not be exploiting, you should be honest in your exchanges, in your business transactions. And, I've had people say stuff like, keep Islam out of this. No, I can't keep Islam out of this. You have to make, your transactions need to be honest. The Quran says, وَيْلٌ لِلْمُطَفِّفِينَ. Woe to those who are dishonest in their measurements, who give wrong measurements. So Islam is not some ritualistic system just confined to prayers or some rituals. It covers your whole life, including your business dealings. You have to be honest in your dealings and so forth and so on. So I feel Muslims are really lagging behind when it comes to, for example, statistical data analysis and research in social sciences and so forth. So we really need to invest in these fields. We really have to focus on social sciences and focus more on, these surveys, assessing the situation on the ground. Just continuing with emotional sloganeering and stuff is not going to get us anywhere. Muslims really need to engage in some very serious self-introspection.
Yes, all of us need retrospection, and we are, during 12 o'clock, so I think we have five more questions. This is Kamal Nawaz, and he's asking, with US exiting the region, Turkey patching up with the Arabs and West African nations getting quiet, how do you see Muslim leadership going into the future? And Saudis are more concerned about their national interests, Turks as well, and Muslim leadership doesn't seem to exist anymore.
I think we have to embrace the reality. There are two things. There's descriptive analysis and there's prescriptive analysis. A lot of times what happens is when I'm giving descriptive analysis of the reality, Muslims tend to get upset. Some people, perhaps they fail to understand what's being said. We really need to embrace some bitter realities. So, for example, you can talk about ummah and you could, which is very basic concept of Islam. The reality at the moment is that we're living under a Westphalian political order. The Westphalian political order gives primacy to the nation state. The nation state is driven by its national interests. So, you can talk about ummah and all this stuff, and I'm not, there certainly are Muslims in this world who genuinely believe in that, and they try to act upon it. Their allegiances and their loyalties and their love is on the basis of ummah. So, alhamdulillah, a person who loves Allah and His Messenger in Turkey or in Somalia or in Sudan or in America is more beloved to me than a Pakistani who is who does not believe in Allah's system. So there are individuals, there are people like that, but at a systemic level, we're living in the Westphalian political reality, where a lot of the times people use all this language of ummah and so forth, especially the ruling elite, to basically gain domestic legitimacy. I think it's important that we're not tricked by all that sloganeering and all that rhetoric. We need to engage intellectual struggle. We need to first of all understand some realities. What is our purpose of life? Are we in this world as a result of some accident? Some almost zero probability of that happening. It's probably zero probability. But anyway, are we here by accident? Do we not have any purpose in life? Are we just to follow some sort of hedonistic philosophy in life, just behave like animals, just fulfill our desires and so forth? Or do we have a purpose in life? This is the fundamental question. If we have a purpose in life, how is that purpose defined? Is that purpose to be ascertained by some Kantian method? Does that come from some utilitarian philosophy? Where does that purpose come from? Or is that purpose divinely ordained? Is that purpose ordained by God? Okay? So we have to take this step by step. Okay, once we realize that, okay, this is actually divinely ordained. Okay, do we have an option? Do we have to believe in that? Once we die, are we going to be raised again? Is there going to be something called the hereafter? If no, then let's just enjoy this world. Let's just do whatever we want to do. Let the mighty ones dominate and exploit the weak ones. But if we do believe in a concept of life after death, then we have to follow the divine injunctions. Then we realize that, even though I am powerful and I can exploit someone, because I'm going to be held accountable by God, I have to follow His instructions. And no, I cannot exploit a weak person, Muslim or a non-Muslim, because God has commanded me to stand in defense of the weak person, whether that person is a Muslim or a non-Muslim. No, I cannot mistreat even an animal because God has prohibited that. So, you take this systematic approach and then you start acting upon it. So you have so now you've realized that there's a hereafter and you've realized that God has given you injunctions. Then you ask yourself another question. Has God only given me rituals to follow? That, okay, you pray 5 times a day, you do this, you do that. Or has God ordered me beyond that? Has God commanded me to shape the political, economic, social system according to the divine injunctions as well? And surprise, surprise, as it turns out, the Quran makes it clear that it's not just rituals. Islam, God is telling you how you are to reshape your political realities and your economic realities and so forth and so on. God is telling you that yes, there's going to be hereafter, you're going to have accountability, you're not going to enter paradise just because you're a Muslim. There's no concept of Islam of just believing in someone as a savior and you'll be saved. No, it's belief and actions, both go hand in hand. So once you've realized that, okay, there's a Islamic order as well, then the next question is, how do I bring about that order? And that's where, you realize that there's a long process of engaging in intellectual struggle. Once I've understood this concept myself, I'm going to try and tell others about it, win over support, and
Yes, this is indeed a long discussion.
So there's a systematic approach you have to take. You cannot be a reactionary, emotion driven. You get upset at someone, you just go and like with some of these guys just going around randomly killing people. So that's unacceptable from Islamic point of view. We're supposed to be people, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا, as Allah says in the Quran. And we have made you a balanced, a middle nation. لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ, so that you may be witnesses over people. That this is a huge responsibility. It entails justice and many things. Again, this is a detailed discussion. We can talk about this some other time as well, inshallah.
Yes, inshallah.
I think if there's anything we should take away today, is that we really need to, number one, engage in self-introspection. Number two, we really need to start thinking and not just be driven by emotions or this reactionary sort of behavior. And number three, don't just isolate people. There are good and bad people everywhere. Engage with people. I mean, as I've said, I think the most extreme cases I can give you is when I was in the UK. I even engaged with some guys from the British National Party and a party known as National Front. This was like a far-right, racist, skinhead types. And guess what? People even from BNP and National Front ranks, there are people who come to Islam and they abandon their racism, when they discover the beauty of Islam. But the problem is we're not carrying Islam ourselves. So, there's no question of us carrying it to others. So we really have to start thinking, have clarity of thought, and then act upon it.
You're right. Let's just take 2 more questions and then we end the space because it's already have been going for a long time. This is a question from Anjum Amara, and she's saying, what is the future of ISKP in Afghanistan, and will ISKP, can it be a challenge for the Taliban?
Yes, ISKP can be a challenge for Taliban. Remember that, there is no conventional war happening. This is going to be asymmetrical warfare. Now, even if ISKP, even though its capabilities have been really cut down by the Taliban, it just takes a few sleeper cells to disrupt the society, number one. Number two, what ISKP is likely to do, I'm talking about the narrative it's going to probably propagate. As Taliban moves towards obtaining international legitimacy, ISKP is probably going to come up and say, look, Taliban has now become a taghut. Not that they haven't already done takfir on Taliban, but ISKP is going to come up and say, look, Taliban is now becoming part of the international system, it's embraced the taghut, this and that. This is going to be the rhetoric. And then it's going to try and recruit people on the basis of this rhetoric. And unfortunately, as I said in the beginning, when we get these two extremes, so on the one hand we've got Rand Corporation trying to secularize Islam, and on the other hand, then that actually strengthens the narrative of groups like ISKP and IS, and they're going to say, look, the Taliban is basically become a taghut itself, and they're going to try and pull some more people from the fringes, and it just takes one person to go and kill innocent people and so forth and so on. So unfortunately, I think it is going to be a challenge, and this is the challenge and this is the reality of fifth generation warfare. It's impossible to have 100% security. You look at some of the most sophisticated countries in terms of their security mechanisms. Look at Israel, for example. It's such an apartheid regime. Look at all the checkpoints. If you ever go there, just look at the checkpoints and how miserable the life is for the Palestinians. Just, how they have to walk through checkpoints at every few meters and stuff. But even despite that, there are attacks and so forth. So it's impossible to have 100% security. And I think Taliban will be facing this challenge from ISKP.
All right. I hope you have got your answer, Anjum Amara. This is the last question. And this is from Fuzail Hassan, and he's asking, is the current law in Pakistan Sharia compliant?
If you're talking about the system that's actually practically implemented, then no, it's not Sharia compliant. And look, I think there's one thing we have to understand. Islam has certain expectations and demands. Islam does not come to basically work parallel to, let's say, some secular system, whether that be, let's say, a sort of a liberal international economic order. You say, okay, let's just legitimize that with a bit of Islam here and there. It doesn't work like that. Islam sees itself as a comprehensive system that includes a moral system, a political system, economic system, social system, and so forth and so on. As I said, for the right, what we find is that, and we believe that our Creator, who understands ours better than us, put in the right places so we don't get in traps. So, in a change in the whole lifestyle. It's not just that we, do whatever we want to do, and once in a week we go and pray, or 5 times a day we go and pray and just assume that everything is hunky-dory. It doesn't work like that in Islam. Your lifestyle has to be reformed, reshaped around Islam. What we try to do today, most of us, we have a comfort zone. We try to fit Islam around our comfort zone. We don't want our social mobility to suffer. We don't want to come out of our comfort zones. We don't want to stop exploiting people. We don't want to stop dishonesty in our transactions. And we just think that, we can just go and pray and fast and that's enough. That's not Islam. Islam is a whole system. And if we have the concept of life after death and accountability, then it's about time we've explored this system and embraced it in its totality. As Allah says in the Quran, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu udkhulu fi silmi kaffa. O you who believe, submit to it, to Islam, in its entirety.
Thank you, Azam. That was a very fruitful discussion that we had today on Afghanistan and the success of Afghan Taliban. I'm sure the listeners have, gained a lot of knowledge. And I also agree with you that we have to come out of our comfort zone if we want to see any real change in Pakistan. Any parting message that you want to give to the listeners?
I think Muslims have a huge responsibility. In Islam does not allow us to discriminate against someone on the basis of their skin color or place of birth, or this racism or some of these sense of superiority. They emanate from a secular sort of realm. Islam rejects this. Islam differentiates and discriminates on the basis that is in human control, and that's the basis of ideology. So, a person, any human, can give some thought and explore, search for reality and the truth, and discover that, okay, here, when I read the Quran, I used to be an agnostic. I think some of you obviously know this. When I was in the UK, I embraced Islam after 9/11. I was a hardcore Marxist, very hardcore one. Anyway, so when you study Islam and you discover that this is the truth, then there's a huge responsibility on your shoulders, and that is to convey this message to others. But the problem is we're not even acting upon it ourselves. Sometimes we are shy, sometimes we try to dilute it, sometimes we try and fit Islam around the dominant liberal narratives, because maybe we're not convinced ourselves or something. Maybe we're just born Muslims. So we need to be convinced ourselves and then engage with others, and realize that Islam is for both realms. It's for this world. If you truly embrace the Islamic system, then it really changes the world. It really does make the world a better place if we do that. Not Daesh style, not like the Islamic State. I'm talking about Islam as it's meant to be. So it leads to a better world, and of course, more importantly, for the hereafter. We have a concept of life after death. There's accountability. It's not the end of it once you die. You will be held accountable, as the Quran says, فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَهُ وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَهُ. Whosoever does good equal to the size of a grain will see it, and whoever does evil, even the size of a grain, will see that. So there's going to be strict accountability by God. You're not going to get away just because you believe in Islam. Islam requires belief and action. So let's try and change our lives accordingly. Let's not be shy. If you really care for someone, you want them to know the truth. Don't don't dilute Islam. Don't try and fit Islam around the dominant liberal narratives of today. The global order keeps changing. Liberalism is the dominant order today. Tomorrow it could be another order. We're not going to reshape Islam to try and fit around the dominant ideology of the day. Propagate Islam as it is, without compromising, without diluting it, and that's how it is. So we have to avoid falling into both pitfalls, falling into the pitfall of those who are, without understanding it, just going around exploiting people, and those who are, the other pitfall, the other extreme, where we're trying to dilute Islam, fit it around the Rand Corporation narratives, because that's not going to help us in the world, or more importantly, in the hereafter. So I think this is the parting message, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Hassan. There is one more question, but I think we should just end the space now. It has been going on for more than 2 hours now, and people are still coming. Anyway, if you want to take it, I can, mention it.
Yeah, I just want to say that I don't have a problem. I can take those questions, inshallah. And also, my DM is open. So if there's anyone who has any questions, feel free to DM me. I'll try and respond as soon as possible, inshallah. Sometimes, the volume can be pretty large, especially with the, Daeshi boys sometimes sending me takfir and hate messages and stuff as well. I tend to get hate messages from Daeshi boys and sometimes from other, like racist crowd and others as well. So I try and find the legitimate messages and respond to them. So feel free to send any questions, inshallah. I'll try and...
This is someone, Amir, and he's asking, do the jihadi organizations of Kashmir consider themselves stronger after the victory of Afghan Taliban? Will they be further strengthened by this victory?
Yeah, there's certainly something of a moral boost. Morale boost. So, for example, when you see, in the context of Afghanistan, there was a huge NATO alliance. And as I said in the beginning, I was old enough at the time. I had started university when the US Shock and Awe campaign started on the 7th of October 2001. I remember what the condition was like. And, some people were saying that there is no way Taliban is going to be this huge alliance. I remember all the defeatist comments and mindset. I was still discovering. I was still in the process of learning.
I think your voice has started to distort.
Fast forward, right? So fast forward that, and we have a decisive victory of the Taliban. So I think that is really going to boost the morale of many people. They're going to find themselves basically with a fresh sense of purpose to stand against oppression, whether it be in Kashmir or other places. But I think many of these groups, from East Turkestan Islamic Movement to Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan to the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and groups in Kashmir, I think many of these groups will probably come to acknowledge the challenges that Taliban is going to be facing. And, perhaps they were probably hoping that they will get some logistical support and so forth. But I don't think that's going to be happening because Taliban will realize that it's going to be under huge scrutiny. The Taliban is no longer a non-state actor. It will have to behave as a state actor. It realizes that. And based on my discussions with the leadership in Qatar and many in Afghanistan, I think they're probably going to do that. They will still face challenges. I think it's going to be a purposeful struggle. And one of the reasons, as I said in the beginning, is because of this hatred and opposition to Islam itself. If you embrace the Rand Corporation version of Islam, then they're okay with that. Open up your markets, give them favorable mining contracts and so forth and so on.
So why people are looking at the Taliban to free Kashmir? Question by Kamran Ali Sheikh.
Well, I think this is a mistake. I can understand that the oppressed people obviously, look to places, and it's understandable. Look, what does the Quran say? يا أيها الذين ما لكم لا تقاتلون في سبيل الله والمستضعفين من الرجال والنساء والبلدان الذين يقولون ربنا أخرجنا من هذه القرية الظالم أهلها. Allah is talking about saying that the oppressed people are making dua. They're saying that, oh Allah, send against us a people who are going to bring us out of this oppression. So if you have that power, when you have that authority, you can really strengthen others as well. So for example, if you look at Islamic history, for example, during the peak period of the Ottomans, the Muslims in other parts of the world as well, they were feeling very emboldened and very strengthened because of the strength of the Ottomans, and there was this sense of direction. So we can understand why people will look to Afghan Taliban seeking help, but people also have to understand that sometimes the ground realities may not allow that. So everyone has to strengthen themselves and deal with their challenges accordingly. I think that's something we have to understand.
And Kaleem is asking, can you recommend a book on ISIS, a book or any documentary?
I think a starting point would be, there's a book by Hassan Hassan. His name is Hassan Hassan. I didn't repeat it twice. That's a good book on ISIS. It's called ISIS. I can't remember the whole name. It's the terror something. If you go on Google and type Hassan Hassan, that's Hassan with double S, and ISIS, it should bring up his book. I think that's a starting point. That's a good book. You really have to understand it from. You can go back to Syria. How Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, for example, was engaged in a struggle against the regime at that time. Or you can start from the post-2003 invasion of Iraq and how the situation developed. How you had the Mujahideen Shura Council, how that evolved into the Islamic State of Iraq, how the Islamic State of Iraq evolved into Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, how that evolved into Islamic State, how it set up the provinces and local chapters and so forth and so on. I think that would probably be a good starting point.
Okay, thanks a lot, Hassan. Jazakallah hai. You've given a lot of time. This session has been going on since 10 p.m. and inshallah we'll discuss some other interesting topic in the next session, inshallah, with Hassan. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.